Welcome to the Courtauld Institute of Art, everyone. My name is Catherine Grant. I'm a reader in modern and contemporary art here at the Courtauld. I'm delighted to be chairing tonight's panel on the alternative arts press in the UK. This has been arranged to celebrate the launch of Counterprint, which has come out with Manchester University Press as part of their Rethinking Arts Histories series. I would like to thank Professor Steve Edwards, Director of the Manton Centre for British Art, for supporting this event, and Alice Rafter for organising everything so beautifully. I would also like to thank the student staff who are facilitating tonight. The format for this event is as follows. We're first going to hear from the book's editor, Victoria Horne, who's going to give an introduction to the scope and stakes of this project. Then we'll move into a panel with contributors from the book, each of whom will give very brief presentations. And then we're going to encourage the audience to take part in our discussion. And I can already see there's lots of people with a vested stake in the topic this evening. Following this panel, you're all invited to come along the corridor to the Research Forum seminar room, where we can have a drink, browse copies of the book, and pick up leaflets from the publisher. I should note that this is currently out in hardback with a price aimed at libraries. So you can get a 30% off voucher here, but this is really something to give a leaflet to your librarian at this point. And there will be a much more reasonably priced paperback out next year. So if you want your own copy, maybe wait for that unless you're feeling super flush. So as will become evident, this publication is part of a growing body of interdisciplinary scholarship that sees publications as crucial sites for research across art history, feminist, left and anti-racist social histories and visual culture. Rather than simply being a repository of information to be taken up by us in our research, their forms, audiences and intentions articulate crucial narratives in their own right. I know I do not have to convince those of you who are already magazine queens, zine nerds, journal aficionados and all podcast freaks. I've made up a few of those. There are many joys in reading, listening and looking at publications that sit outside the mainstream, as they can be passionate, patchy, sometimes pedantic, but rarely boring. However, in tackling political topics and histories, some of the material covered in these publications is difficult. So I just want to give you a content note about one of the artworks that will be discussed later. This is a work by Rashid Areen, which uses a racial slur as its title. It's a jarring title, presented in quotation marks, as if it's being hurled at the artist, registering his experience as a South Asian man in the UK, an experience of racial abuse that was and is shared by many. So before I hand over to Victoria, it's my pleasure to introduce her to you. This collection builds on her research over the last decade that explores the historiography of art history and feminism. She has written numerous articles and has edited some fantastic collections. I would urge you to take a look at her 2021 virtual collection for the journal Art History that looks at feminist approaches across 40 years, with her brilliant and also open access introduction touching on many of the issues taken up in this new publication. She's also edited the excellently titled Danger, Women Reading from 2019 and was co-editor of the 2016 collection Feminism and Art History Now. She has recently completed her first monograph entitled Writing Our Own Art History, Feminist Art News 1989 to 1993, which is forthcoming with Manchester University Press. And I know it's hotly anticipated by many of us. I'm really looking forward to reading this. Victoria is currently Assistant Professor of Arts at Northumbria University in Newcastle. So please join me in welcoming Victoria as she introduces Counterprint.
Hi everyone, thanks Catherine for that introduction and thanks to Steve and the Manton Centre for hosting us this evening. So I want to start not with the book itself, but with an artwork by the Glasgow-based artist Kate Davis. In 2023, Kate was commissioned by the Common Guild to develop a project with her local library in Port Shields. This led to Natural History, which you can see on screen, a satirical, observational study of that library environment, which unveils a fantastical ecosystem buried amongst its dictionaries, bookshelves, walls, and languages. The idiomatic creatures that roam the library, a high horse, fishwife, bitch, old bat and cow, are awkwardly oversized reminders, pushing at the sexist edges of language and inherited knowledge. The large-scale cutouts are constructed of crayon frottage that reveals the texture of walls, the cover of a pocket Oxford dictionary, or the familiar shapes of paper clips and a QWERTY keyboard, suggesting the animal's deep roots in the materials of the library. Max Ernst once described frottage as a means of making the unseen visible, and the crayon's animal forms make awkwardly visible a gendered lexicon, the etymological foundations that exert pressure on what we, its users, are able to know and to say about the world. It is Davis's quasi-scientific insistence on knowing through material encounter, of rubbing and picking at rough edges, that awakens the lumbering creatures. And there is something of the feminist killjoy in her prodding at these worn, discomforting phrases. The woman artist on her high horse. The work's title, Natural History, with its loaded 19th century residues, ironically emphasizes the constructed nature of knowledge and how it comes to us through specific systems, buildings, and languages. Davis's playful frottage serves to summon and agitate, to jolt habitual reading patterns by looking askew. Here, readerly engagement is configured as reading surfaces, to probe and uncover meanings in inherited repositories of knowledge. I start with this recent art project because I think it quite usefully orients our attention to the material and infrastructural conditions of knowledge production and circulation. Counterprint is part of a broader tendency of recent years, which dwells in that materiality. Those libraries, slides, PowerPoints, periodicals, textbooks, or online repositories that mechanize art history, as well as the infrastructural and social worlds through which artists and historians move. There has been a preponderance of printed things in galleries of late. Newspapers, textbooks, magazines, bookshops, and libraries, a heft of published informative matter sits at the heart of contemporary art practice. What connects many of these disparate projects is an enthusiasm for physical print publishing as historical record, container of information and ideas, magnet for community formation, and potential site of resistant reading or writing otherwise. In his 2016 study, Anti-Book, Nicholas Thoburn acknowledged that the age of print's dominance had passed. We now inhabit a convergence of the print and digital that allows us to see more vividly the contours of those previously ubiquitous media practices. He alerts us to the importance of sensory visual experience in this, saying that this shift has enlivened our understanding of print's earlier specificities and generated what he terms a felt appreciation of media form. Whilst recognising the methodological and certainly political limits of feeling as an approach, feeling media has been an important attitude across counterprint study, which dips into and tries to inhabit the structure of feeling or broader life world of specific periodical communities. Thrown into relief by our digital existence, the case studies included in this volume explore alternative ways of working with and organising around media. The examples provide inspiring instances in which inventive processes of production, circulation and reception have opened a new set of possibilities for how to think about art, politics and society. So this collection of essays uncovers, or seeks to uncover, the key importance of periodical publications and publishing infrastructures to the directions of British art and art history after 1970. From the mid-20th century, more affordable and accessible printing formats created greater opportunities for self-publishing, giving artists the freedom to put out their own periodicals and explore topics neglected by the mainstream press. Serialised arts publishing really flourished in the UK during the 70s and 80s as the field was stimulated by an increasing availability of technologies, including electric typewriters, duplicators, and offset printing, allowing amateurs to bypass traditional training barriers and get involved directly. The post-Robbins expansion in higher education, the growth of the contemporary art sector, and social movements, including the New Left, Black British politics, and second-wave feminism, further energised the cultural press. Numerous journals, magazines, and newsletters ambitiously launched, thrived, burned out, and folded. And there's a very good reason such papers have been referred to by one historian as heartbreakers and money burners. From glossy journals to DIY bulletins, that cultural library served complementary and sometimes contradictory ambitions. It provided forums for discipline-specific inquiry, engendered platforms for political exchange, disseminated information and artworks, or facilitated exchanges within communities. We can appreciate, I think, why the democratically accessible paper periodical held particular promise for artistic subjects whose labour was not yet recognised by mainstream channels. Yet, it is only quite recently that scholars and curators have started to really appreciate publishing as a galvanising cultural force. This volume grew from the belief that bringing periodical studies into conversation with art history cracks open a story of deeply political intellectual labour. The story shows how communities of artists deployed independent print publishing to challenge the established order, circulating information and ideas that would radically unsettle and remake the map of British art. To counterprint the alternative art press in Britain after 1970 approaches contemporary art from a new route, focusing its critical lens upon the grassroots zines, newsletters, manifestos and journals that have shaped arts practices and communities over the past 50 years. The phrase, the alternative art press, is a nebulous one, but essentially it encompasses grassroots publications driven by artists and activists, as opposed to more commercially driven magazines or academic journals. It is true, of course, that these categories can and do slip. This book does not aim to be comprehensive in scope. Each chapter offers a close case study of a specific magazine, press, or publishing format that we hope opens a small space of understanding. Two questions really drove the collection. First, how has this alternative press shaped the history of art in Britain since the 1970s? And more reflectively, what methods, tools, or approaches do we need to study and make sense of these artefacts? With 12 chapters, that's not true, with 13 chapters, there are multiple, sometimes conflicting answers to these questions. Yet taken together, these chapters enhance existing histories of cultural production by foregrounding publishing labour as a constitutive element in the wider fabric of the art field, alongside the artistic, curatorial and pedagogical labour that is typically drawn focus. The volume's contributors follow book historians in looking at print artefacts as material objects instead of chiefly through them to contents. The Feminist Arts news editors, for instance, in their interview in the book, recall the magazine's decentralised production process, whereby different groups of women across the country guest-edited individual issues. Conceptual advancements in feminist intersectionality arose, they believe, in part from this publishing method. Theory, in this instance, preceded by their collective periodical labour. The tools of that late 20th century DIY print ecology now read like a distant language. X-Acto knife, Lectroset, layout board, T-square, rubber cement, waxing machine. It's almost impossible now, one spare rib editor stated, to recall how labour-intensive the processes were in making up the finished pages. The pre-digital production of grassroots periodicals was mechanised by typewriters, Gestetner duplication, photocopiers, screen print, nascent desktop publishing, and sustained by grassroots industries of typesetters, print shops, and distributors. If thought is something that emerges, at least in part, through the material processes of writing, typing, and copying, alternative modes of organising and thinking about aesthetics, politics and society were conditioned by, rather than simply expressed through, the publishing infrastructures of that era. As art historians, today we now do much of our reading, research and teaching online, using digital resources. Yet when engaging with digitised print objects, we can easily miss physical traces of making and handling, such as the bite of metal type on paper, misaligned duplication, torn edges or smudged ink. As one scholar perceptively puts it, digitised periodicals render invisible the work and hands involved in their production. Close attention to the materiality of periodicals is therefore also an orientation to labour history, to the manual work of document production, and to the work those documents do in making and maintaining artistic intellectual communities. Bringing periodical studies into conversation with British art thus alerts us to a history of political labour in which communities of often queer, black and feminist identified artists deployed independent print culture to circulate information and ideas that would radically unsettle the status quo. From Letraset to dial-up, fax machines to Facebook, the creation of a grassroots alternative press allowed its contributors to connect, share information and document practice. In 1987, the editors of Bazaar settled on that architectural metaphor as their periodical title because it would declare the function of the magazine, and I quote, as a meeting place, a place where anything is possible. Hopefully this evening's short presentations will give you a flavour of the exciting materials and approaches included in the book. And we'll also have some time, as Catherine said, to have a discussion and some questions afterwards. But each of the case study chapters shows how centering periodicals can change or nuance the story of contemporary art in Britain. The 50 years charted by this collection witnessed an expansion of voices, approaches and attitudes driven by allied inquiries across race, gender, class and ecology. And the alternative cultural press has had a decisive role to play in staging these intellectual confrontations. Questions of critical historiography really underpin this study, and the book's title, Counterprint, alludes to the countering, querying and disruptive characteristics of a grassroots independent press intent on making its own history. In design, a counterprint or proof is an impression pulled from a freshly printed work onto another sheet of paper. This reversed copy, allowing the artist to check the success of a composition, assess its accuracy, or experiment further with the print. Presenting a cracked mirror or counterproof to codified accounts, the alternative press emerges as a site for critical assessment, scrutiny and inspection, whilst also forming a vibrant record of contemporary art in the making. The chapters in this book begin with Rashid Arian's published performances in Black Phoenix and end with the irreverent online platform, the White Pube. In between, we stop off to explore the vibrant feminist press in chapters focused on Spare Rib, Feminist Arts News, Format Photographers Agency, and the Women Artists Slide Library. Hilary Robinson has described the challenge in women art in the 80s and the importance of those quick and I quote, I spent 3 months sitting in libraries wading through back copies of magazines, trying to find information, reviews, articles, anything to build up a history of what has been happening in recent years. We also revisit the heated debates around painting and conceptual art published in the erratic and sometimes combative Artscribe. The richness and tenacity of the British Black arts movement really comes to the fore in chapters focused on Mukti, a magazine charting South Asian women's culture, and on Urban Fox Press, a publishing house set up by Maud Silter and Lubaina Hamid in acknowledgement that, and I quote, being written out of history can happen to you. Who makes black women's work visible, if not other black women? Analysis throughout these chapters remains firmly anchored in materiality. Bazaar, South Asian arts magazine, is noted for its bold, new wave design, and also for its ostentatiously large format, which was both impractical, being unable to fit through a letterbox, and a material commitment to celebrating the abundance of South Asian arts activity in Britain. If the first 9 chapters of Counterprint explore the alternative communities and fresh perspectives that the art periodical press made possible in Britain from the 70s to the 90s, the final 3 chapters brings us up to a much changed media present. Reflecting on moments of transition, or these reflect on moments of transition in publishing, and ask what a counterprint culture might look like today. A history of the journal inventory and its cultural networks in the mid-90s to mid-2000s shows how this periodical project was indelibly shaped by the transitions to digital publishing and the profound effects of the knowledge economy on cultural labour. The penultimate chapter turns, almost perhaps inevitably, to the e-flux phenomenon, seeking to understand the expanded arena of arts publishing that saw this 1999 mailing list grow in hypervisibility to encompass 5 news digests, 3 periodical publications, an archive, cinema, bar, podcasts, and much more. An interview with the White Pube offers a useful closing note on both the legacies of this alternative press in Britain and its possible futures. Given this volume's attentiveness to published materials, it seemed fitting to finish here before I hand over to some of the contributors with a brief comment on the book object itself. And I really have to thank the team at Manchester University Press and the Rethinking Art History series for doing such a wonderful job with this object. The spare black ink drawing on the cover is by the UK pop artist Derek Bosher. It's part of a series made in 1977 exploring magazines and newspapers. It was a good few years ago now that I came across this drawing at the Tate Archives, and I was looking through a 1978 issue of Aspects, a newspaper-style journal of contemporary art published out of Newcastle. And unfortunately, we don't have an essay about Aspects in the collection, but it's certainly a periodical that's overdue some critical attention. Bosher's work was included in this issue of Aspects, and I was just really struck by it and thought that one day I wanted to try and include it in something. And I'm pleased with what it signals on the cover here. In this image, we see various tools of communication: a stack of magazines, a rotary telephone, a pen and scraps of paper with a note stating, "Doodling won't help." The drawing is titled "Artists Could Change the World, or How to Make Left-Wing Jewellery," which would seem to suggest that on the one hand, publications could be merely decorative window dressing for real politics. But more optimistically, with these scattered fragments of communication, the implication seems to be that drawing, writing, and publishing might be at least one route to changing the world. Thanks.
So I'm very pleased to introduce the 4 contributors. We do have one contributor, Catherine Spencer, who is stuck on a train, and it doesn't sound like she's going to make it before we finish. Do you think there might be a chance?
She's not going to make it, but I can see that Anthony is here, and he's a contributor to the book, so I'm sure he can also answer questions. And yeah.
I'm sorry that we don't have her presentation today. But we do have 4 fantastic contributors. First of all, we'll have Samuel Bibby, who's the managing editor of the journal Art History. He holds a PhD from the University of Sussex. He's currently working on a book project which looks at periodicals and different forms of participation in 1970s and 1980s Britain. In addition to his chapter in Counterprint on Black Phoenix, recent publications include a very good essay on camera work in British art studies earlier this year, and an essay on feminist art news shortly forthcoming in the Journal of European Periodical Studies. I feel like next year is going to be Fans Year. kind of feel like we're all going to have to like write something to join alongside the vote. Yeah, no, up for the t-shirts. Yeah, there's probably some good ones advertising fan.
First issue.
Yes. Then we will have Lily Evans-Hill, who holds a doctorate in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art, which I have the privilege of co-supervising. Her research looks at visual and print cultures informed by feminism in Britain in the long 1970s and focuses on the history of the Women's Artist Slide Library as both a case study and resource for this work. And then we will have Sunny Ruggiero, who holds a PhD in the history of art from the University of Edinburgh. Her thesis focused on visual culture of women's movement periodicals in the UK, specifically Spare Rib magazine. She's worked as an associate lecturer at Newcastle University and is currently a part-time research assistant at Talbot Rice Gallery. And then finally, we'll hear from Matthew Macaulay, who's a painter, curator and researcher based in Chester. In 2021, he completed his doctoral study at Coventry University, examining the shifting teaching practices of a loose network of representational painters who taught in British art schools between 1975 and 2005. He's currently lecturer in fine art at Wrexham University.
So my contribution to this book discusses the role of the small group in the emergence of art criticism informed by feminism, and how publications can be used to trace group work by women artists, art workers and art historians across the 1970s in the UK. And it looks at artist publications produced by groups and contributions to feminist newsprint, like this one, which is the front cover of an issue of Shrew, to track how women artists formed intersubjective, discursive spaces through which to explore new forms of artistic practice, art history and criticism that were deeply informed by the politics and activities of the women's liberation movement. And crucially, it discusses publications before the founding of a periodical dedicated to feminist influence art practices here in the UK, so pre-1978. So this chapter also considers what using autodidactic informal knowledge formations might mean for the researcher, and highlights the discursive and collaborative sites that formed these new approaches to art history, such as those seen in the article. And I do this through a discussion of a concept I developed called history work, which proposes that artists, critics and scholars informed by feminism formed new historical methodologies, critical practices and created resources like study groups and periodicals to aid writing and making histories of women's art. And the term recognises the work to reshape and re-examine knowledge production that happened in feminist contexts, like small groups and periodicals, and under the political aims and organising conditions of the women's liberation movement. And this term also expands the act of making histories to include these infrastructures used to facilitate history making, such as groups, publications, and I also talk about slide registries a lot. So in this issue of Shrew from April 1973, which was a publication published out of the London Women's Liberation Workshop, the first and second page features an article on Artemisia Gentileschi, a 17th century Italian woman artist. Gentileschi is framed as an artist engaging with a feminist consciousness through her depictions of women and using herself as a model for her painted heroines. The writers quote a male art historian as recognizing Artemisia's identification with strong women, but attributes it to her personal inclination. The writers respond, "What this critic explained away as an idiosyncrasy of the artist, we see as a feminist consciousness." Written anonymously, but perhaps by the editorial group, the authors state that they were inspired to write about Gentileschi by an article they had read in the Feminist Art Journal, which is a US-based publication edited by art critic Cindy Nemza, which was pointed to in Rosika Parker's article, Old Mistresses, in Spare Rib number 10 of the same month, April 1973. And both of these articles follow the 1972 exhibition Old Mistresses, which had taken place in Baltimore. The authors thank Aileen, and I think this is Aileen Strasberg, who was a painter, but also an organizer, and Judy, who I think is Judith Adams, who were both members of the Art History Collective and the Women's Workshop of the Artists Union, for their support and for the slides, giving them the slides of Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes and Self-Portrait as Allegory of Painting. The authors narrate their discovery of Gentileschi's work through a trail of footnotes, and we can imagine their research circle assembling literature, articles and slides of her work. So in my chapter, I link this article to wider efforts to recover historical women artists, and in particular to the research projects of the Women's Workshop of the Artists Union and the Women's Art History Collective, who would meet to discuss historical women artists' works they had seen in exhibition catalogues, and sharing slides of contemporary practitioners further afield, their research notes, and of course a kind of more convivial discussion. These study groups were new experiments with history writing and research, and formed from the small discussion format that was central to the women's liberation movement. The Women's Art History Collective explained that these meetings raised questions about the values and categories of art history itself, developing methodologies for art history formed within the discursive sites of the study group and by extension the periodical.
Can you hear me? Okay. Just before I start, I would say as well, I co-authored my chapter with Victoria Horne while I was completing my PhD. So this work is a combination of both of our brains and academic intellect. Okay. Some of you may be familiar with Spirit magazine, and some of you may not. If you are, you may indeed recognize the periodical's distinctive paper strip logo, designed by Kate Hepburn. Hepburn created the logo with pieces of torn-up tissue paper, giving way to the rough and frayed edges of each letter. The italicized ib hinging away from the Roman R, the logo design was a nod to the inspiration for the publication's name, referring to women's supposed creation from Adam's rib. Sparab was set up in 1972 by Marcia Rowe and Rosie Boycott, in part prompted by their experiences within the energizing yet deeply sexist countercultural press of the 1960s. The magazine published 239 issues over 21 years, offering updates on campaigns, conferences, culture, and the diversity of debates within the women's liberation movement in the UK. Sparab was the most widely circulated feminist magazine in Britain, and as historian Natalie Tomlinson has put it, it was the mouthpiece for the national movement. Now, Sparab is not known conventionally as an art publication, yet it played a significant role in supporting and making visible the works of women artists. Indeed, in the late 1980s, a full-page subscription promo featuring a Cupid's arrow chalked on a blackboard, which you can see here, claimed it to be the magazine with art, suggesting that women's creativity was the beating soul of this popular periodical. In decades since, Spare Rib has become the most theorized, celebrated, and critiqued women's movement magazine, and its legacy has been consolidated by journal articles, essay collections, and the British Library's Beleaguered Digitization Project. Art was not a separate aesthetic realm, but deeply and profoundly embedded in the activism of the women's movement. Perhaps because of this, and decades of scholarship since, women's art has remained an under-acknowledged aspect of the magazine. Sparab published reviews on artists such as Stephanie Bergman, Margaret Harrison, Susan Hiller, Mary Kelly, Margaret Priest, and Penelope Slinger. It looked at pioneering group shows like Lucy Lippard's exhibitions at the ICA, A Woman's Place at Randor Terrace, Feministo, and Phoenix Arising, whilst also giving space to women's art collectives like the Hackney Flashers and Women's Workshop of the Artists Union. On its covers, it featured works by Paula Modersohn-Becker, Hannah O'Shea, Labaina Hamid, Sudipa Biswas, Maud Salter, and images by Format Photographers Agency featured repeatedly. Laura Mulvey's famous evisceration of Alan Jones was first published in the magazine in 1973. Much of the coverage in the 1970s was under the editorial eye of Rosika Parker, whose tenure frames our chapter in the book. Into the 1980s, Sparab significantly turned its eye to the coverage of Black women's art, and by its final issue in 1993, the magazine had formed an invaluable archive of that critical decade of cultural production. Revisiting this periodical archive shows that women's art was firmly at the beating center of the 1970s feminist periodical press. Thank you.
So my chapter is on Artscribe. And Artscribe's this magazine that appears in 1976. These are 35 issues. And when I started first looking at this periodical, there were people would, like my lecturer and so on, talk about it being quite fiercely a defender of painting and stuff. But when I read the first 5 issues, I was struck that it was kind of a slightly broader magazine. But the other thing, I was kind of coming at it from a PhD that wasn't about magazines, it was about education. So I was interviewing a lot of painters and basically about their teaching. And we got onto the topic, obviously, about their own educations, and I quickly realised that this magazine had been kind of, the seeds of it had been placed in the 60s and early 70s. So the magazine kind of comes from the art school culture of the 60s and 70s. So most of these students, most of these artists as students would have encountered people making zines, making magazines, art magazines in school, but they'd also encounter things like the group critique, which was kind of like quite well known now. They were all basically at St Martin's, so James Walker, Karen Walker, and Ben Jones were all the founders of the magazine and attended St Martin's. And there they were encountering people making magazines, but this group critique, and kind of group critique is basically where they really valued encountering lots of different people, lots of different people's viewpoints. And when they left the art school, they encountered basically a solitary world where they didn't get to teach and talk to anybody, and they were in their own studios. So basically, when they're on the outside, they kind of reinvest in this. But it's a period of time of change. So whilst they're in art school, again, the culture of the art school in the 60s is kind of broad. But what they encounter when they come out of art school is that the mainstream has kind of zoned in on something, which is not what they're interested in doing. So while some of their colleagues are interested in exploring the expanded fields of like performance art and land art and so on, they're interested in kind of still investigating painting and sculpture, and particularly abstraction. So basically, the magazine is, they're interested in kind of continuing these conversations and trying to kind of like promote painting and sculpture in a kind of landscape that's kind of more interested in investing in other areas. Lately, Sean Scully's been on record talking about a different decade, but he was talking about the art world being only big enough like a small boat that when someone gets in, someone has to be chucked out. I think at the kind of 70s, when they're all coming out of art school, they're feeling like they're being chucked out of the boat. So basically, they're feeling lonely, they're feeling chucked out, so they all get together in this group crit kind of environment that they make in the early 70s, and they realise that some of these kind of conversations they're having in the studios might be interesting to share. So that's where the magazine comes from. The magazine initially is a very broad church, and it's kind of, they're not paying anyone, so anybody's putting things in. They're also kind of rotating the magazine, so the magazine is on like arts education, one issue, you know, kind of, whilst a lot of them don't seem to have a great deal of interest in arts education, even though they're using kind of the tools of the institutions that they were studying in to kind of like basically promote their work. But kind of the magazine slowly moves more and more towards a promotion of sculpture and painting near the end. So I guess what I noticed from this was that kind of the way that the magazine's been written about was very much about kind of how it promoted sculpture and painting was in opposition to the mainstream. But actually, by going and interviewing the majority of the founders who were still alive, sadly one of them had passed on, Karen Folger, it was really interesting to see that they had really conflicting views on what that magazine was there for. So the kind of argument of the chapter is about kind of re-examining it through the lens of kind of arts education, but also kind of looking at it not just as kind of a tool for them to promote painting and sculpture, but as kind of perhaps a thing for generational development. So kind of their feeling as young painters, I think, was that kind of they should stop what they were doing and kind of just basically kind of move on to a new field kind of production, whilst they kind of wanted to invest in kind of seeing what new fields could be found in this kind of field that had been well ploughed. But you know, kind of, I think that what you see in the magazine is them breaking away from some of the strong orthodoxies that they were taught. So in art school, kind of, I think the systems and kind of like minimalist kind of teachers that they had were programming them, and kind of the title is Escaping the Straitjacket. It's basically what I'm showing in it is how they use it as a critical tool to break away from some of those strong orthodoxies that have been programmed into them. Yeah, so thanks.
Thank you very much. I wonder whether is this a picture that Catherine would have
It
talked
would have been
about?
Catherine's, yeah. And it's a good one.
It's not. I don't know if you want to say anything about her contribution to the books. It's on Format Photography Agency, and you can see a whole range of uses of their photography here. We've got one of the members of Format in the audience, so maybe in the questions there may be more that can be said. But for now, I just wanted to open up with a question that kind of it's just a kind of a bit of a nosy question really, but I think it also maybe talks about how there's a lot more accessibility of kind of alternative publications now through various digitisation projects. So, you know, we can kind of look through the whole of Spare Rib except for the redacted bits on leftovers, or, you know, you can get an archivist to send you like scans of a periodical you might otherwise have to, you know, spend a huge amount of time and money to go and visit. So I was just wondering, like, what drew you to the publication that you have talked about, or set of publications or materials, and where did you first of all access it? And maybe we could start with you, Matthew, and then work our way down.
Yeah. So I'd heard like some mysterious comments about a guy in Manchester who taught abstraction in the 1980s called David Sweet, and I looked for copies of Artscribe, and it was actually really hard because the university had a couple, but they were also in terrible states. So some of the early copies I had to track down myself, kind of by just going to usually the shop across from Tate Modern, and just seeing. One time I got one for like £1. Fantastic.
Excellent.
They've increased in value.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was just basically hearing about kind of some of the things that these people had said in the magazine, and then having to go and triangulate whether or not it was truth. So I think because it was quite all focused in terms of like going and interviewing people, people would say things, and then I would need to have the magazine to fact check whether or not they really said those things. So the magazines were like really important, but there was no way that I could access those online. So I would have to pay someone to kind of photocopy it for me or something like that. Luckily, very early on in my PhD, I found basically most of some that had been chucked out from, I think, Bristol Polytechnic for about 20 quid. So that was cool.
Yes.
But it was kind of like, I think it was before my PhD, I'd heard about this very strong character who was forcing students to investigate abstraction. And I was just kind of fascinated about some of what seems like quite a strong orthodoxy towards kind of what students should learn. So kind of, yeah.
Thank you.
Where did we encounter them? I guess when I was 19, I started volunteering at the Feminist Library, which is a great space if you've never been. There is probably the largest collection of feminist periodicals from across the world in the collection, which you can go and view in very lax formats, which is both great and bad. Yeah, I guess I kind of looked after some of this material and rehoused a lot of it, and of course just curiosity got the better of me and I started flicking through this stuff. In terms of, I guess, I also look at some other publications in my chapter. I look at a magazine called Mama, Women Artists Together, which is a publication that was published in Birmingham by a group in 1978, and it essentially kind of collects articles from Spare Rib, but also kind of other musings, and creates like the first periodical that tries to kind of capture this material of like early UK feminist art activity, and I discovered that at the Feminist Library too, and then I talk about Phoenix, which is a pamphlet that Phoenix, a group of artists created that they kind of gave out alongside their installation. But I guess, so I encountered most of them at the Feminist Library, and I was really interested in obviously art history and the kind of the beginnings, the kind of the rousings of kind of art history and feminism together. And Shrew is really interesting, and like Spare Rib, it's not an art history publication, and Shrew is really not an art history publication. I mean, this is probably one of the only things about art in Shrew. But that's what I thought that was really interesting, this like idea that art history could become part of the feminist political project. And so that's why kind of Shrew is particularly interesting to me. But yeah, you should definitely go and visit all of these periodicals at the Feminist Library. It's like what an amazing resource to have here in London.
I think they're also looking for volunteers, so if anyone needs a nice quiet place to work and open up for them, I think they're always looking for someone who's happy to sit on a laptop. But, Sam?
I first encountered Black Phoenix through another magazine. I was writing on the magazine Block, produced by a group of artists and academics at Middlesex, and I had a conversation with Lisa Tickner. I said, please can I talk to you about this? And she said, oh yes, absolutely, and you must talk to all of the others as well. Remember something, that we're all going to say different things and you should believe nothing that any of us tell you. Instead, you should listen, but then you should just go and hang out with the objects themselves, which is where you'll get everything that you need. And I dutifully did as I was told. Lisa Tickner, don't want to disobey. And one of the first things that I was really struck by was the whole series of exchange adverts in Block for a whole range of different magazines, one of which was Black Phoenix. And I started mapping out this whole process of exchange adverts, which were all pretty much, given for free as a way of, I guess, I mean, I was thinking about what you're saying in terms of pivotal communities and the whole Benedict Anderson thing, a way of, galvanizing like-minded sensibility. Anyway, so from that, I went and looked at all of these, and there we are. That was Black Phoenix. It took, I think I I think first time I went to see it was in the Stuart Hall Library at Inver, which is also an exceptionally good repository for a huge range of periodicals.
Thank you.
So I live in Scotland, so the archive that I came across there, which was the Glasgow Women's Library, if any of you have been there, which is a really, really wonderful space, kind of unlike anything else that I've come across in Scotland in terms of kind of collecting feminist history. I went on a trip as a master's student and had just become interested in magazines. I started writing my master's thesis on a counterculture magazine from San Francisco called the San Francisco Oracle, and that was more like a hippie psychedelic art and a whole different side of publishing. So when I saw Spare Rib and the feminist collection at Glasgow Women's Library, I was immediately just struck by the materiality of the object itself and the look of the publication. So once I finished my master's degree and decided to do a PhD, which is Spare was the focus of my PhD, I went back to GWL and spent some time with the publication and had done quite a bit of research into Spare Rib and kind of started to question why no one had looked at the visual material aspects of the publication, because it is such a visually striking material, and then seeing how much art writing was done in the publication as well just really helped me identify that there was this real need for someone to take a look at it from an academic perspective, specifically within the discipline of art history and visual culture. So yeah, a bit shorter than everybody else, but it's quite easy to pick it out. So
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you want to say anything, Victoria, because you've obviously overviewed the whole.
I can say something about fan, perhaps,
Yeah, go
if
for
it's
it.
useful. So there is a roundtable discussion in the book with different contributors to Feminist Arts News. And it's a magazine I first came across. So when I was a PhD student in the early 2010s, I would come down to the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths, and Althea introduced me to Van, and I was using it at that point very much, as I sort of spoke about in the introduction, as a kind of secondary resource, something that I was looking through for the articles, specifically at that point about arts education. And then whenever I got my first job at Northumbria, which was in 2016, just by total chance, they had the Monica Ross retrospective on in the university gallery when I think it was like a few months after I got there. And there was a display, because she was one of the co-founders of FAN, and so it was a display of the full print run. And at that point I thought, this is really interesting thing. And I started to think about how I might write about it. And funnily enough, actually, like you mentioned, Sam, I was at that point working on a blog as well. And so Northumbria University Library was Newcastle Art College, and then it became Newcastle Polytechnic, and then in the early 90s became Northumbria University. And if you go deep into the bowels of the library, there's an amazing arts periodicals collection from when it was an art college. And it's all kind of hidden away now, and I'm terrified every time I get the lift down that it's just not going to be there anymore. But they had a full print run of Feminist Arts News, so I was very lucky. And I thought that it would probably, at that point I kind of thought this would be like a quick project. It was like almost 10 years ago, so, but yeah, that's how I came across it.
Thank you for those stories. And I think a lot of us are aware of a lot of kind of periodical culture being kind of put into skips, or, you know, what can we lose as it's being scanned? And I think those stories will say why it's good to keep the actual objects. But I wanted to open up to the audience and see if anyone has any questions for any of our panellists, or if you have any observations of your own about the alternative art press. I know we've got people here who've also worked on various publications.
Thank you very much. My name is Toby. I'm a master's student here at the Courtauld studying Black British art, which has been really fun. And I was just wondering where exactly were some of these periodicals circulated? There's a lot of discussion around like it not being mainstream, so kind of what are what do like underground, I guess, spaces look like? And then sort of a follow-up to that, is there any like class implications for who would have access to these works?
It's a great question, and I think it's sort of varied across publications, so I don't know if anybody wants to answer that.
I can.
Go for it.
So I asked that because they're just a bunch of guys who just left art school. Like, how did you get it out there? And they were like, well, we covertly sold it at like openings at the Surfing Time or for 20p. So they just basically sold it to their mates initially. So quite a small audience, and it was only like 100 copies initially. So yeah, and then just slowly grew distribution. But yeah, just selling it covertly at openings.
That's maybe one end of the scale of the publications, and then yeah.
And it's the question that we get asked in this game quite a lot, and I mean that story is very typical. You know, I mean, tales of people with boxes of them in the back of their car. So a lot of the a lot of the distribution is done by the people who are making the magazine themselves. Sometimes there are a small group of a sort of small handful of sort of not-for-profit distribution. I'm trying to think of the right way to describe them, but like full-time distribution is one of them, which is based at based in Clerkenwell in the same building as at one point a Spare Rib and who operate on a sort of shoestring sell or return type model. Lots of bookshops as well. What's the name of that? Compendium books, and there was sort of a handful of bookshops that would take them. But it's the question that periodical studies scholars get asked all the time, and when people say, "What was the print one?" You're like,
Well, I guess
not many.
Yeah, I mean, Spare Rib is a bit of a different picture.
So Spare Rib, as I said earlier, was the most widely circulated kind of feminist magazine in the UK. So at its peak, around 30,000 copies, although some of the people towards the end were saying 90, but that's been heavily kind of pushed back against. But it was distributed in various different ways. So it was distributed in, for example, W.H. Smith in some different shops, although it didn't necessarily always show up in the shop. So a lot of women were writing in saying, I actually can't get a copy because it wasn't considered like a woman's magazine. It was often left off the shelf or kind of put to the side in kind of a miscellaneous section. But then they also had an appeal within the pages of the magazine to have their readers distribute it. So they would say, are you going to a conference? Are you doing this? Can you bear to stand out in the cold and give out copies of Spare Rib or sell copies of Spare Rib? They were left in, doctors' offices, kind of passed hand to hand by friends. So I think it varies, like Sam was saying, based publication to publication. And in terms of thinking about working class and access, I think that very much depends on where you're living. So Spare Rib made it across the pond to the United States. It made it to Ireland, but then it was actually taken off the shelves in Ireland due to censorship. It was found in Scotland, in the north of Scotland, but not as often because it was heavily dominated by it was a London-based publication. So I think access to it would have been much stronger in places like London. But yeah, sorry.
Victoria wants to say something, and we've got Steve wants to say something in the audience, and we'll come to some more questions.
Right, it was just to answer your second question, which was about class, I think. Because I think that's a really important point, that when a lot of these grassroots periodicals, if they're kind of reliance on voluntary labour, like who has the time and who has the availability to participate in some of these communities, and it's something that came up in the 2 working class issues of Feminist Arts News, which were co-edited by Chala Kameri Berman, and it's actually, they mention it in the roundtable of the book. It was one of the kind of angriest editorials, which is, you know, where they're kind of calling out their more middle class sisters for having more time or to dedicate to the magazine. So it is something that was being discussed within these periodicals at the time as well. But thank you for the question.
Thanks. I mean, it's a ritual in these events to thank the speakers, but you've made me feel so old, I'm not going to do that. I may be the only person in the room who's actually used the Gustetner and Letraset. And it wasn't for...
Don't be so sure, Steve.
It wasn't for the art press. But, I mean, one of the things that I think... So, where one encountered a lot of these things, I think, really matters. So a lot of them, you know, you found in the small art galleries. I remember buying many of these things in Icon in Birmingham or in Cardiff, in another small gallery there. But the other place, and this is central, and I think it's left out of the story, is all of the small left-wing bookshops that existed in Britain in the 70s and 80s. I remember in Birmingham, for instance, near the coach station, there were two rival left-wing bookshops. Those were the days. But you know, so things like this were encountered in those spaces. Of course, that privileges a certain kind of readership, and that's what you get. In other instances, as people said, you know, you sent your check away in an envelope, and you'd get them posted through the door, and you know, so you know that's how a lot of these kinds of things circulated. There were real advantages, though, to this kind of unofficial culture, and I mean, I won't go on, but mainly, I mean, I think in immediate contact between readers and writers, readers and publishers, you know, so that there was a kind of relationship between the production of the magazines and the readers, which I think is completely lost in digital platforms, where, you know, it becomes very, very anonymous. So I think that there was a kind of moment where this kind of publication was important to cementing kind of networks of radical readers, alternative kind of networks of thinking and criticism and so forth. I won't tell you my anecdote about the closure of Artscribe, but I may do over a drink.
Thanks, Steve. I wouldn't necessarily agree with you about that comment around digital platforms, but maybe that's also a conversation for over drinks about how people are like utilising those, you know, to still create communities. But we've got another
Can I just
question.
say something quickly?
Yeah.
Is that all right? It's just because Catherine's not here. So actually, that's a really, really useful comment. Thank you, Steve. And you're right. I think the thing with a collection like this is that you make choices about where to focus attention. And actually, we focus very much on the production of periodicals and not on the reception. But Catherine Spencer has recently co-edited a book called Grassroots Art Making, Political Struggle and Activist Art in the UK, 1960 to present. And it's going to be out with Bloomsbury early next year. And it looks much more broadly at the kind of infrastructures of that period, including bookshops and print shops and all lots of different things that were happening. So if you are interested in that, keep an eye out for that book as well.
I was thinking of Lucy Delap and also, you know, the
Victoria Basin.
Yeah, Silver Moon and all of those. I think there's some great work's been done on feminist bookshops.
There's like a special collection for, is it one of the feminist journals on like publishing in bookshops as well, I think.
Oh, yeah, Margaret Jolie, yeah.
Yes, that's worth looking at too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. My name is Wilson Tarbox, and I'm a PhD student based in France, but I'm writing a cultural history third text. So absolutely loved this presentation. And special thanks to Sam, who very kindly shared a copy of his essay with me prior to publication, which is very helpful for the part about Black Phoenix. But the question I wanted to ask is between the end of Black Phoenix in 79 and the beginning of third text in 87, there's the intervention of the GLC under Ken Livingstone. And I've spent a lot of time since I've been here during this trip in London, in the London Metropolitan Archives, sort of poring over the minutes of the Ethnic Arts Subcommittee and other various subcommittees related to arts. And I was struck by the sheer volume of projects that are funded during that period, related to anti-racist struggle, related to feminism, related to a lesser extent to queer identity. And so my question is, how did the, I think it was 6 or 7 years of the GLC's existence before it was abolished, affect art presses? It seems to me like some things went from much more of a DIY status to temporarily receiving public funding, but then in the case of third text, GLC policy influenced Art Council policy. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit.
Does anybody want to pick that up?
I mean, I don't know if I have a sort of macro answer to that, but I think, I mean, Bazaar is the interesting example there. I mean, I don't know how much work though Alina did on rooting around in GLC stuff, but I mean, that I guess illustrates the point you're making. I mean, I know you spent a long time trying to find stuff with FAN, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so knowledgeable, I think, with the GLC funding, but the Arts Council funding that FAN received and 10/8, they both started receiving it in the same year, really helped kind of, as you say, professionalise their production process. In some ways, that was also perhaps their downfall, because what had started as a grassroots kind of hand-to-hand thing, you know, was harder to maintain when in 1993 the Arts Council changed its mind about funding a lot of these things. So it's hard to kind of go back to that initial format.
If you could link that to technology as well.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is it was the Arts Council funding that was much more crucial during this period, and you know, there was a big old cull of magazines that happened in the sort of the mid to late 90s and the early 2000s. Like one of my first jobs was on the Women's Art Library magazine, and I was a subscriptions and distribution manager, so that was a paid position because it was a funded publication. So there was a period where like it wasn't well paid, but they were, you know, we were a team of people who had paid positions, and that magazine closed when the Arts Council funding was withdrawn because they thought they couldn't have too many women's art or feminist magazines in their portfolio. So, you know, I think it's really about an Arts Council story for publications, but I don't know for sure. Do we have any sort of last questions before we move to right in the corner there? Romy, someone with their laptop.
You mentioned the Aspects magazine in Newcastle, and obviously you're at Northumbria and you mentioned the arts periodicals collection there. Is there a lot of evidence of like local production, and would that make for like a worthwhile local study or more regional study? And if you did do a regional study of this kind of thing, what would be different from what's already being done in this publication?
I mean, that would make a great PhD if anyone is in a position going to Northumbria. Do you use that?
Well, I mean, I think the really interesting example here is FAN, which moves around the whole time, and so isn't really ever based in one place, and is the whole. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know why I'm ventriloquizing. You're the FAN expert, but yeah, it's constant. So the editorial structure is that each issue is produced by a different collective of people, and one issue's in Leeds, and then it's in Bristol, and then it's in Birmingham, and so is not only the women who are participating in producing it, are they from around the country, but there is always a kind of something of a focus in the coverage as a result of that. But yeah, I mean, as well, you know, as well as aspects, you know, there's all sorts of. I mean, some of them we've already talked about. I mean, 10/8 from Birmingham is an excellent example.
You were speaking earlier about
Variant, Circa, like, and there's, I mean, that would be a delicious project.
And lots of small art school magazines, particularly around art and language.
Oh, indeed, Ostrich,
and you know, so there's
issue,
lots
all
of
of
those.
it. Oh yes, I mean,
I was
again,
involved in one in Cardiff, for instance. You know, kind of. So there were lots of those small ones, often coming out of art school cultures.
So maybe that's a good project for over drinks, to write up a list of everything that should be in counterprint number 2, or like a digital iteration for people who wish to do an MA thesis or a PhD on a small run magazine. But for now, I'd just like to thank our panellists and Victoria. Thank you very much.